You are listening to The Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Are European voters really all that excited by a show of Franco-German unity? Should Russia's new ceasefire plan be trusted any further than one can throw a harpsichord? And why is anybody at all still voting for the ANC? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Tessa Shishkovitz and Phil Clark will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Singaporean filmmaker Nicole Midori Woodford at the premiere of her debut feature Last Shadow at First Light. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Tessa Shishkovitz, UK correspondent for the Austrian weekly magazine Falter and the author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit, and by Phil Clark, Professor of International Politics at SOAS, University of London. Hello to you both.
Good evening, Andrew.
Good evening.
Tessa, given that you are surrounded by Australians and that,
yes.
and that therefore these
As
may,
an Austrian.
these may be the last words you utter for the next 30 minutes or so, you should go first. I understand that you have been recently in Vienna sorting out the Middle East.
Yes, we made peace and it worked. So I can only recommend let the women on the stages and put them also in political cabinets and possibly in the army if you have to. Because I hosted an event there of the Women Wage Peace of Israel and the Women of the Sun of Palestine. And they came from Israel and from Palestine to Vienna to talk about how they are planning to make peace. And they have been working together since October 7th, which is quite astonishing that they managed to do that, because it has become, as you may understand, very difficult for people. For example, in Bethlehem, there's one Palestinian woman, Reem Hajjajre, she sort of speaks out for collaboration with Israelis on peaceful dialogue, and that is a big thing nowadays.
I would think. Are there places that people can read about these deliberations? Because this does sound genuinely very interesting.
Yes, they have websites and they host events, and so it's easy if you Google Women Wage Peace or Women of the Sun, they come up. It's even better if you speak Hebrew or Arabic, because these websites, of course, are also run in these languages.
Okay. And Phil, it's been a while since we have last seen you. Have you been labouring away on your imminent, barn-burning, block-busting bestseller?
Indeed. My academic tome on Rwanda, which I know the world is baying to read.
Will it be out in time for Christmas?
Sadly, no. So you'll be bereft of gift ideas. I think my contribution to world peace has been to make myself very scarce and live in a cave. That seems to have made the world slightly less conflictual, that I've been hidden away trying to write this book on Rwanda's welfare system. So stay in your chair with that such excitement, Andrew. I could see you leaping at me to get an advance copy.
Well, we will start with the European Parliament elections, which begin next Thursday, June 6th. For the minority of British citizens who ever bothered to vote in these, it will be a spectator event. The minority of European citizens who bothered to vote in them, and yes, I know it was 50.6% in 2019, but come on, are being ushered pollwards. It's a ridiculous word. Who would put that in a script? At least in part by two leaders beginning to be considered limping, if not outright lame ducks. French President Emmanuel Macron, who is in his second and last term, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who has generally rather struggled to assert himself. Tessa, President Macron has been visiting Berlin. Incredibly, it's the first full-blown state visit to Germany by a French leader for ages, like a quarter of a century or something. He has actually taught himself to speak what sounds to me like reasonably decent German, but is this image of Franco-German friendship rousing great excitement in either country, never mind across the continent?
Well, I think it's very easy to make fun of all of this, and Macron speaking German sounds as if sort of the German teacher is sitting in the first row and sort of looking at him sternly. But it's quite a good attempt, actually, especially if you're in Dresden and you are trying to give an impression that the Franco-German motor of Europe is not stuttering. And I think people also easily overdo it because, of course, there is a very pro-European government with Macron in France and a very pro-European government with Scholz in Berlin. And that's already really good. The fact that they don't usually visit each other at official state visits has to do with the fact that they see each other all the time during the European Union summits and all sorts of other lower level things. So it's not so necessary that you bring someone in with a whole parade of things. But what is true, of course, is that everyone's a little bit challenged now that at the European elections, the far-right parties are sort of on the up, and Macron's own party is sort of faltering. Scholz, the Social Democrats, of course, also have a little bit of a problem because his own coalition doesn't work so well with the Greens and with the Liberal Party there. So, as usual, European elections have to do a lot with national moods, and this is it's quite of a muddled ground. But in general, I think we should not overdo it with the having fun on their behalf, because they are sort of trying to keep this thing together, and they have kept it together over the last years. I mean, to describe them as lame ducks is sort of a very flippant way of saying that someone who has still another 3 years as a president ahead of him, that he's practically out of the door.
Phil, even when the United Kingdom was a member of the EU, I think France and Germany saw either or both or each other as the default leaders of the EU, and I think they definitely do now the UK has left. But does anybody else see it like that necessarily?
It's interesting to see a lot of peripheral European states jockeying for greater influence. There seems to be a sense across the continent maybe of this German Franco alliance faltering a little. And so we've seen Italy on the front foot in the last couple of weeks. Big talk about the need for Italian leadership on industrial policy and migration policy in particular, which is clearly a massive issue at these elections. The likes of Poland, I guess, with Donald Tusk as the Prime Minister, obviously very familiar with the European stage, claiming the rightful place of Poland in a more senior European position, also a frontline state, obviously.
Not without reason.
Not without reason, given the context of Ukraine and Russia and Poland feeling that threat and feeling like they're making some big strategic decisions around that conflict. The likes of Estonia as well, these states kind of inserting themselves where we haven't heard them before. So a sense perhaps that the landscape is starting to diversify away from simply that German Franco influence.
Tessa, you mentioned the concerns, and polls suggest they are reasonable concerns about how the far right might do in these European elections. But there has been the always heartwarming spectacle of these parties fighting amongst themselves. France's National Rally has said that they won't sit next to the AfD in a European Parliament. But do you think there really is that much difference between the two?
Well, there are differences. Also because some parties want to present themselves as almost like post-fascist. There's Marine Le Pen in France has really tried to distance herself from the most far-right corner of French politics. And so does...
i.e. her dad.
I heard that, exactly. But also, since she has done this, of course, there have been more extreme far-right parties and movements coming up. So, there's always sort of, it's a payoff. But you have this with Giorgia Meloni also, who is actually more pro-European than people would have thought, so much so that Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, is sort of thinking of pulling her into more a kind of coalition, possibly with the EPP after the elections with the Conservatives, so that she has even an option to talk to some people on the further right. And that again now has opened, as you mentioned, the rift with the AfD in Germany, where, the Germans are catching up with these far-right movements now in parliament, because for a long time it didn't play a role. And now the AfD is coming to really into the forefront with far-right Nazi stuff that is being uttered in this election campaign. And so the guy, Maximilian Krah, the head of the AfD for the European elections, has sort of told us that there were not only terrible people in the SS of Adolf Hitler in the Second World War. So that was a little bit too much for Marine Le Pen. And she said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with him. So these two main big far-right blocs in the European Parliament could maybe not necessarily work together well, and they could still do it. So we have to be very careful. That's why it's so important that people go to vote. Don't have to say this in the UK anymore because you guys left. But on the continent, of course, it's important that people pick up their votes and vote for democratic parties, if it's sort of center left or center right or green or liberals or whatever. There's a wide option. I don't want to make a campaign here, but I think it's important to express this European option of elections. And actually, if you look at the Eurobarometer, because you were saying that it's just above 50% who went to vote last
just
time.
Over.
We have now a lot more interest, it seems, because I think the war in the Ukraine and a few other issues, also the one in the Middle East, possibly have opened up the idea in European minds that it's quite good to have, maybe, even if they fight all the time, but it's better to not be on the battlefield than in the parliament in order to sort out conflicts between nations.
Just finally on this one, Phil, I don't wish to court complacency, but if we look again at the recent ructions within the AfD, can we reassure ourselves at all that extremist parties of all kinds, but perhaps especially the far-right nationalist type, do tend to contain the seeds of their own destruction? Because you can only keep a lid on the, for example, maybe the SS weren't all bad guys stuff for so long. It does tend to come out eventually. Yeah,
it's interesting watching these far-right parties try to moderate themselves for years and years and years. They're always going to great lengths to try to say, we're not as extreme as we were in the past. But as you say, as the campaigns go on, it seems that they can't help themselves in kind of revealing their true colours. I think possibly their bigger impact, though, has been to push some of the kind of more centrist parties further to the right, especially on issues of migration. It's been interesting to watch von der Leyen and other established European figures go to great lengths to say, we will crack down on migration. We're going to do deals with Mauritania and Libya to try to stem the flow of migrants across the Med. Using the kind of hardline language against asylum seekers and refugees that we didn't expect from the top European leaders, even at the last election. We are seeing that rhetoric this time, and I think that's where the right-wing parties have really exerted their influence.
Well, let's take a look now at Russia. For reasons requiring no elaboration, it is difficult to take seriously anything Russia promises, signs, or even suggests. To establish a benchmark, Russia is still waging war against a neighbouring nation which meant it no harm and posed it no threat, and justifying itself with a platform of lies and fantasies. So it is prudent to regard a recent offer of a ceasefire from Russian President Vladimir Putin from the other end of a barge pole. Nevertheless, for what little it is doubtless worth, Putin is apparently willing to cease hostilities along current front lines. Flint-hearted skeptics have suggested that what he actually wants is a pause to regroup. Tessa, is there any reason at all to take this seriously?
Well, I think it's just everything is important when it comes to Putin. We all don't have real access to him. So Guy Falkenbridge from Reuters, who did this report, they spoke to a few people that are anonymous, but they are sort of Kremlin insiders. And I think it's quite, if you want to at all understand the thinking or the mood in the Kremlin, then we have to take this report seriously. It might mean only that these people who leaked these ideas about ceasefire now are from the more moderate wing within the Kremlin, and they also think a costly war feeding thousands of young Russian men every month into the meat wolf of the meat grinder of Ukraine is not a good idea in the long term. It might just be, as you said, that Putin would like to get a little bit of a pause to regroup, and he doesn't want to do a mobilization so quickly again in order to fight on and to expand the territory he has already occupied in the Ukraine. But I think the more important point here is that I think that he's trying to look into the next month when Zelensky will parade up and down a Swiss mountain to invite all these delegations coming from all over the world and to hammer out a peace plan on his terms with them and try to pull in the global south that hasn't been so interested in sort of getting involved in this European war. And I think Putin, who will not be in Switzerland on the 15th and 16th of June, is maybe trying to stay in the game. So he then has this report coming out in Reuters. On the next day, he had his press conference in Minsk, in Belarus, to say that ceasefire on the current lines could be a good idea. So he tries to portray himself as someone who could stop the war if he's being taken seriously. And in the end, of course, Zelensky and the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people have always made clear that they don't want a ceasefire with minus 20% of their territory.
Well, on that subject, Phil, I wonder whether this is some sort of kite-flying exercise from inside the Kremlin, the idea being that this is a marker for what Putin might actually be willing to settle for, i.e., and I don't think it requires, I mean, this would be a shabby, miserable compromise, but I don't think it's that unimaginable that Russia keeps what it has of Donbass and Crimea in return for which it waves off the rump Ukraine into NATO and the EU.
It's interesting the way this is being reported, that it's a move by Putin or his inner circle perhaps to undercut those talks in Switzerland. I wonder whether it's an attempt to influence those talks, whether it's an attempt to say, look, there is a possible compromise here. A certain amount of territory will have to be ceded, but that's just realistic in terms of how the conflict is going. And if you want to end it, you're going to have to give something. I just wonder whether there's a different game going on here, that these 80 leaders will go to Switzerland to only argue for peace on Ukraine's terms at the moment is unrealistic. From the Russian point of view, to simply roll the Russian forces back and to return Ukraine to its initial shape of border is unpalatable to Moscow, and you have to get the two parties to agree to a process. So I think that there may be an attempt to try to influence what happens in Switzerland. The other thing that's very interesting, I think, from Zelensky in the last couple of days is he seems very unsure that Biden is going to go to those talks in Switzerland. He seems very, very worried about this. And it strikes me as surprising that Biden has not come out and completely backed these peace talks. So I do wonder, even from the Ukrainian point of view, how confident they are about reaching even a kind of draft solution when we get to Switzerland in 2 weeks' time.
Tessa, do you think this is also part of this narrative Russia is now pushing, the idea that Zelensky is an illegitimate president? Because in peacetime there would have been a presidential election in Ukraine quite recently. Those processes are suspended under martial law. Polling suggests that most Ukrainians understand that and are perfectly fine with it. And it is, of course, a bit rich coming from Vladimir Putin, given what we know of the conduct of Russian elections. But nevertheless, is this line going to stick with anybody?
I think that these Russian influence attempts and propaganda, this vision of the Russian truth, has influenced so much in the last years. One of the, I'm not sure that the thing about Zelensky not having been elected or refreshed his presidency recently, I think that's not so as much the issue at the moment, because everyone understands he's in the middle of a war and people cannot even go to polling stations without being afraid to bump into pieces, like people have been in the garden center in Kharkiv on the weekend because Putin decided to bomb civilians while they were shopping for flowers on Saturday afternoon. So I think the bigger issue are other things. For example, that Putin presents his ceasefire ideas as something legitimate because it has been negotiated in Istanbul 2 years ago. And it had never been negotiated in Istanbul 2 years ago, seriously. It was also not Boris Johnson who undermined these talks. The fact that these talks didn't lead to anything was because Putin invaded the Ukraine and sort of started a war that he wasn't planning to end unless it's on his terms. And so I think we always have to look at everything that Putin or anyone in his circle says as an attempt to sway opinion, especially in Europe, where, of course, there are countries where people would really like to have a ceasefire, or they would like to undermine Zelensky's strong stance and saying that he's a president who is legitimate and is leading a nation in war and cannot, for that reason, also go to elections at the moment.
Well, let's look now at South Africa, which is voting tomorrow in a general election, and a reminder that the very second you are done listening to this, you can tune into the latest episode of Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk, which considers the long, wretched decline of the African National Congress, which has governed South Africa generally pretty badly since 1994. Despite running on a record which would get them chased to the border at pitchfork point in most democracies, the ANC will probably just about win this election, but may be compelled to govern in coalition, conceivably with partners who make matters, in fact, even worse. Here is a clip from the Foreign Desk, former South African opposition leader Tony Leon.
If the ANC does poorly and they need a big coalition partner, or at least have some kind of arrangement, such as a confidence and supply, then I think there are a number of options. If the option on the one hand is the ANC forms a government with the EFF, which really will destroy this country and its economy, or does some arrangement with the DA, then I genuinely think that the DA would have to give very serious consideration to performing a national service, even if it isn't to the party's best interests. I'm not sure it's going to be that straightforward.
That was Tony Leon on the latest edition of The Foreign Desk. Phil, the big question first, is it clear to you why literally anybody still does vote for the ANC? Because to recap, rampant crime, dreadful corruption, astonishing unemployment, and they cannot even keep the lights on.
Couple of reasons. One is history, the legacy of a liberation movement that brought apartheid to an end and ushered in.
That is no small change, but many, if not most, South Africans who are now weren't actually born when that happened.
Indeed. So you've still got a large electorate that remembers pre-94. But I think that the second issue is massive welfare spending by the ANC, which especially in rural areas, if you look at the voting pattern, most of the discontent with the ANC is in the large urban centres where the electricity's been turned off and where the informal economy is really teetering. But the ANC's big voting bloc is in the rural areas where it almost can't lose. And so the ANC, has gotten complacent over the years about that very kind of consistent voting pattern. But listening to Tony Leon, and we'll listen to him later on the Foreign Desk, is fascinating because let's not romanticize the strength of the opposition here either. The Democratic Alliance has suffered from massive infighting, has had a real race problem of its own. Most of the opposition parties in South Africa, in their own various ways, are also dysfunctional, and that has also helped prop up the ANC vote, especially in the last couple of elections.
That is doubtless the case, but with the ANC in particular, Tessa, is it yet another demonstration of the fact that with a few exceptions, very few exceptions, revolutionary movements tend to be ill-equipped to governance because they're two very different skill sets. Revolutions require thinking and communicating in broad strokes and grand statements and dramatic gestures, whereas actual government, at least effective government, is complicated, technical, incremental and quite tedious.
Well, I'm just racing in my mind through successful revolutionary movements who actually could govern democratically for a while. And I think, for example, the Czech Republic, if you take a recent example, Václav Havel, who then was president, and all these intellectuals / civil movement groups that came out of 1989-90, this first generation, they actually sort of governed the country for a while. There's a right-wing populist movement from time to time taking over. So I think it's not completely clear that nobody can do a successful revolution or regime change and then govern. I mean, in the case of South Africa, I'm not an expert on this, but I think if you have an end to white minority rule and then you establish these new parties and you have a black movement like the ANC that struggles with the huge corruption in the country, so that's a really big problem. And then you have the Democratic Alliance that has a white leader. I mean, come on, guys, that's not gonna work. You have to sort of mix and match a little bit if this in the end will be a real sort of pluralist society, and that might take another generation.
There is a thing with the Democratic Alliance, and I do get into this with Tony Leon on the Foreign Desk, Phil, that it is perceived as fundamentally a party of white people, maybe nice liberal white people, but white people nonetheless. Its current leader, who does meet that description, John Steenhuisen, does have a sense of humour. He did note that Barack Obama got elected president of the United States States as a member of a minority, so clearly it's not impossible. I think we can go ahead and assume that Mr. Steenhuisen is well aware that there's a slightly different dynamic in play there. But I just wanted to go back to something both you and Tony Leon were saying. You correctly pointed out, Phil, that the other parties that the ANC might end up governing with are not necessarily an advertisement for anything either. We heard Tony Leon saying that if they go into power with the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is run by a disaffected ANC fire breather called Julius Malema, the other option would be Mkhonto we Sizwe, the new party launched by former President and just astonishing crook Jacob Zuma. It could get quite bad, couldn't it? I mean, this might actually be worse than being run by the ANC.
Yeah, and it won't happen. So Leon's flying a flag there on something that won't happen. And I think it unfortunately shows a certain amount of DA desperation that they're even having to try to campaign on that basis. That the ANC have set their stall out and basically said if they get into a coalition government, which they almost certainly will, they won't do it with the DA, they won't do it with the EFF, and they won't do it with MK. What we are likely to see is a really messy coalition with 11 or 12, and it may take that number of minority parties to form a government come Thursday or Friday. And then the real game begins because, firstly, you'll need the government to elect the president. Indeed. So this is not a presidential election. The president is elected by a majority of the parliament.
And it has to happen quite soon, doesn't it?
They have a week in order to do it. And if they can't do it, we go back to the polls in South Africa next week. So that is at least a theoretical possibility. But also it's all the cabinet positions would also have to be agreed on in what could end up being a really inchoate coalition. So I don't think we're going to see any of the major opposition parties in bed with the ANC, but what happens with this sort of endless constellation of minority parties is going to be extremely interesting to watch.
Well, to the world of romance now, and it says here in a British newspaper, the kind of journal which can absolutely be relied upon not to fill its feature pages with too good to check will this do flannel, that lovelorn singles wearied of dating apps are instead turning to running clubs, possibly to make more use of these skills they acquired escaping suboptimal online dates. Am I right? Somewhat nauseatingly, several running clubs around the world have begun promoting themselves as adjunct matchmakers, boasting of their successes on TikTok, which might not be a ghastly Chinese Ministry of State Security data harvesting apparatus. Tessa, are you enticed by this, the combining dating with jogging?
I think it's a total trend. I hear it everywhere that
Really?
People go off apps to date and do some sort of, activity with other people together. And I think it's a really nice thing. I also always say at this point of the debate that people should not badmouth dating apps or internet dating in general, because for people my age, and I'm 56, so you don't just easily go in a bar and find people who are not married possibly or whatever otherwise attached, and it's just a different dating ground. So internet dating was always a very good option for people in their second rounds like I did 13 years ago. So don't badmouth dating on the internet. But I think it's a lovely idea that people go out now and sort of reverse a little bit the trend that you couldn't get a date anymore without sort of hopping around on Tinder and having sort of, choosing too many or too little at the same time without checking them. And I think running, somebody said that it's actually a bit smelly, and isn't it a bit unsexy?
This is what I'm wondering about. Nobody's looking their best.
But Andrew, have you ever had good sex? Does that come sort of, with sitting across a table and sort of properly eating a little salad?
I've certainly never gone to that from running.
Have you not?
No. It does sound like I've been missing out. Phil, does this strike? I mean, there's a pivot from horizontal to vertical jogging that I'm trying to rise heroically above.
Sorry, it's so embarrassed.
Here.
I'm so sorry, Andrew. Can't do that with an Australian.
He's been dying to have someone ask him about his sex life on this program for years now.
We are an unembarrassable people, Pepper. Phil,
so European of me, almost French.
Are you, Phil? Are you excited by this idea?
I'm petrified by it in the sense that my wife and I were having a very rare coffee on Saturday morning away from the children. This happens, sort of once a year. And we were sort of sitting outside and we were descended upon by, I would say, at least 40 joggers who'd come out of Hampstead Heath to this one cafe. And so our romance was fundamentally undermined by these joggers, sweaty, lycra-clad. I mean, most of them extremely stunning, it had to be said, sort of intimidatingly beautiful.
So did this strike you as some sort of hybrid jogging orgy thing going on?
There was something like that going on. There was palpable, sweaty, sexual energy that was at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. And I sat there and I thought I was trying to...
far too early.
It was. There was too much going on. So I read this article and I thought, I've seen it. I've seen it up front. Good for them, shocking for the rest of us.
But I have a suggestion for both of you.
Please.
Okay, off the sweat here, off the sweat. So what I noticed, that there are lots of other activities that people pick up now to go and date. And I've suggested it to some of my younger ones in the household. One that I thought was excellent is the single life drawing classes that you can go to in London. So you sign up to that. There are other people who are unattached coming, and everyone is sort of basically doing a painting class or drawing class, and you can also book, drinks and whatever doing that. And there's no stress. You don't have to go home with a date because you don't set up with a date. It's just a group of people who are like in the running club, who are meeting to do something together. And I think it lowers the stress, and it might have a higher success rate.
See, I would find that incredibly stressful, because surely with something like that, the whole thing is that you're having to do something that you're probably not very good at, and that is what people are going to judge you on.
Football games. You can go to single football games and watch them. Wouldn't that be one thing for you?
Not really, no.
Australian football?
Again, I don't think anybody is looking at their best in a beanie.
The thing about the running is that you seem to be able to, watching the group dynamics of these hordes kind of running sort of through London parks there's a kind of survival of the fittest. So I guess you discover people of a similar fitness level to you, because there's kind of people who get to the front of the pack who look like they could just be Olympians, and then there are people at the back who kind of look like me, actually, look like they're kind of an inch away from a cardiac arrest. But maybe that's where you find love. You turn to someone and think, you look like as near to death as I am, so maybe we should hook up here. So there's a balancing going on.
Are you saying you meet somebody towards the back of whatever the running equivalent of the peloton is called, and say to them, like, you look like you can be asked with this about as much as I can?
And we could just vanish into the bushes and no one would ever notice us. So it's absolutely perfect in this sense.
Getting into the mood. Good one.
In nature.
On that heartwarming note, Tessa Shishkovitz and Phil Clark, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, over the weekend, Monocle's Naomi Zhu Elegant attended the Singapore premiere of Last Shadow at First Light, the debut feature of Singaporean filmmaker Nicole Midori Woodford. After the screening, Naomi sat down with Woodford and lead actress Mihaya Shirata to discuss the film.
So the film is about the story of a young girl who's trying to unravel the mystery of her mother who disappeared. It's also about a family portrait where we follow the lives of the different family members who are all kind of broken, and Ami sort of intersects with all of them, and also with the spiritual realm in the film. This film was inspired by encounters I've had with strangers and also with my family, and I've been inspired to write this even more so after I visited Tohoku in Japan in 2017. And the film is also about existence, memory, and loss.
So you were the writer and director.
Yes.
How did that change the creative process, having both of those roles?
In addition to the writer and director, I was also the editor and the co-producer. So it was challenging because I had to wear many hats while I was working on this film. And that meant that being the director means that you always have a bit of the director piloting, behind these other roles, which meant that it was quite exhausting because I have to run through every single decision through all these multiple hats at the same time. So I hope that my next film I would be able to just focus more on just one role. But I think what I learned from this process was that I learned how to communicate exactly what I want, and I learned how to distill what I really want for the film to capture into, you know, moments and sound or visuals very efficiently. And I felt that I had definitely leveled up as a director, because of that.
So you filmed in both Japan and Singapore, and I think visually those are kind of very different places. At the same time, the film has a very kind of, the visual aesthetic feels really unified throughout. Can you talk a bit about how you wanted to kind of join those two places together and at the same time contrast?
Definitely, there's many parts to this answer, because there's the story part and there's also the visual part and the sound part. So I'm going to try to capture all of these. I think in terms of the story, I wanted it to unfold from when Ami was having a lot of distance with her father and having this sense of isolation. She's not really fitting in school, she's not really fitting in at home, and she struggles to have her grandma remember her because her grandma is also suffering. And when she travels to Japan, there's a relationship that unfolds between her and her uncle, where he takes on the role of a surrogate father. So it's almost like she's developing a sense of kinship. And then she meets this young boy as well on the road. So visually, I wanted it to change from something very urban to something very raw and very much about elements like wind and water and the rain, the fog. So in terms of sound, that also complemented that as well. And when we were working with sound, we captured environment recordings, ambience from Singapore and Japan to kind of contrast these two worlds, because I wanted Ami to almost enter a more metaphysical world.
So very exciting. We also have the lead actress here with us. Mihaya, what was it like to play this role? It's your first starring role, right?
Yes. Well, Ami was really difficult character, and even though the script kept changing because of the pandemic and we had a lot of time, the one thing that was sure was how she was really sensitive to people's feelings and also to the spiritual things. So to prepare for the role, I wrote a diary journal as a character Ami, which was a suggestion from my director Nicole. And at first, I couldn't understand why and how to write those journal as a character, but that really helped me to get into the character, and eventually I was able to become Ami-chan, yes.
And I know that in the film you speak Japanese and Chinese, but you had to learn Chinese for the role, right? What was that process like?
Yes, I was learning Chinese a little bit before I took auditions, but because Ami was a Singaporean girl, she had a Singaporean accent, so I needed to practice that, and with my producer and also Nicole, and that was like one of the stressful things. I try to memorize of course the lines, but also the pronunciations and things like that, and I try to like record my voice every day, every night, listening to it, practicing it, and asking my parents if I sound the same. Yeah. But that process was, even though it was difficult, I think it was really important because she was, of course, Singaporean girl, and I'm still continuing learning Chinese. So, and I hope I get a chance to speak Mandarin again as one of the character or in the role.
That was Monocle's Naomi Zhu Elegant speaking to Nicole Midori-Woodford, the director of Last Shadow at First Light and the film's star, Mihaya Shirata. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Tessa Shishkovitz and Phil Clark. The show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.